to have you here.
When I was little, now I am.
I know you from when you were little. So your blessing is very welcome here. I'll correct myself. No, we are very interested and genuinely happy to have you here and to hear your perspective from the land of Israel regarding the situation, which is certainly not an easy one at all. I mean, literally every single day you hear so many different things about what could possibly happen in just the very next few hours. And I can only say this much. I believe for the population in the land of Israel, it's quite terrible when one intends to plan to go somewhere on vacation or when one has a business trip arranged. One doesn't know if they can return, if it might not be possible for weeks to find a flight back, or even if there will be any means of traveling back home. So it's definitely very, very distressing for the people living in Israel. Thus, it's certainly not an easy situation. Regrettably, there are many aspects that are perhaps not entirely to the liking of the majority of Israelis, things that are, in fact, somewhat excessively extreme. I can say that too, so I'm sure not everyone likes it. Of course, one can certainly have an explanation for situations where people participated, or indeed very, very many people participated concerning the October 7th event. When you consider the October events and all that transpired around them, the sheer brutality, horrific nature and so forth of how it was executed, then it's quite understandable that some individuals might react in an inappropriate manner. In conclusion, perhaps it should be said that the upcoming elections are also interesting. I'm sure you'll be able to give us a lot of insight into how you perceive this situation.
Still have questions? It's not the main topic, but we are...
Maybe we can mention that somehow. I'd like to ask you to begin.
Thank you ever so much for such a kind welcome. I'm truly delighted to be back here again. I was just here in October, but that was over half a year ago, and a completely different issue was dominant then. Gaza, Hamas, the Palestinians. And that has been overshadowed by what happened recently with the war with Iran. For me, and I say this every time I'm here, for me it's a bit of a home game. I know many people here, some I haven't seen in a long time, but we still know them from way back. My father, long deceased, was a brother in this lodge. I just found out that his name is amongst those memorialized on that plaque over there, so to speak. And I'm also happy that practically, well, not all tickets were sold, but most tickets have apparently been taken. So I'm happy to be here, but at the same time, I somehow feel myself in an uncomfortable position. A bit like an imposter, like someone who has taken on more than they can handle. Because I'm supposed to somehow analyze the effects of a war that first and foremost is incredibly complex, with ramifications stretching almost all over the globe, reaching out in every conceivable direction, and second is not even remotely close to being over yet. It's still ongoing and we don't know where it's leading. And we wouldn't even know what an end would mean, for example, from an Israeli perspective. Even if this conflict somehow ends, Israel is, in a sense, still at war. Since its very inception, Israel has not experienced even a single moment of peace. And true peace for Israel will only arrive when there are no longer any surrounding forces that refuse to acknowledge its right to exist. And these forces do indeed exist, of course. And in my imposter role, I'm reminded a bit of an old anecdote that you might already know. It's about the legendary American Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. He was in China in 1972 in Beijing and met with the Chinese politician Zhou Enlai. And legend has it that Kissinger once asked Zhou Enlai, "What, in your estimation, are the repercussions of the French Revolution of 1789? To which Zhou Enlai supposedly responded, "It is much too early to make such a judgment." A milder version says it was a misunderstanding, and Zhou Enlai thought he was being asked about the effects of the May 68 student unrest in Paris. But even that was many years ago by then, and for him it was too soon to tell. And I must assess something unfinished, so with no time passed, I'll still try despite the lack of distance. In any case, I want to content myself with analyzing Israel's situation, to limit myself to that, and not look at the whole world. It's already complicated enough. Israel, as you know, every question you ask about Israel, you can certainly try to answer it. And then 5 more questions pop up, and you're completely lost again. However, I do want to try and clear up some misunderstandings and point out a few aspects that you might not have picked up on from a distance, unlike what you would perceive if you were right there in that region. I believe that in Europe there's a certain ambivalence and even a division in the assessment of this war. We've just witnessed a war that isn't truly over yet, and perhaps there's a particular tendency in how that assessment is made. Because, of course, people in Europe also know that a terrible regime rules in Iran, Islamist extremists who have massacred their own population, who persecute and execute opponents, and who oppress women. And that's not likable at all, and people don't like them. But on the other hand, they're not exactly sympathetic figures, are they? So there's the American President Trump, who is vulgar and aggressive and whom people don't like. And then we have these trigger-happy Israelis who are always so sensitive and feel they must defend themselves, always overdoing it. And people don't have any particular sympathy for them either. And one gets the feeling that people somehow begrudge it. That is to say, if it's the case that perhaps the United States and Israel have achieved certain advantages, then one doesn't want to accept that and doesn't grant them that success. I'd say, with a certain sense of Schadenfreude, they perhaps follow the Iranian narrative, which claims, no, the Iranians actually prevailed and can now dictate terms and present their demands. And you live in Europe, I don't, but I do get the clear impression that there's at least some perceived equivalence. And as I said, not necessarily endorsing the exact way Israel and the US see the situation, but rather to some extent also agreeing with or wanting to agree with the Iranian point of view on matters. You can look at it however you want, but there are still some sobering facts. And these facts state the Islamic Republic of Iran is weaker now than at any point in its entire history as we speak, after this war that is hopefully or perhaps ended, or perhaps not. And I'd like to illustrate this with a few points. The first point, and we'll start with the military aspect, is the issue of ballistic missiles. And from an Israeli perspective, that was probably the main motive for entering this war. Perhaps it's perceived differently. The nuclear program or atomic bomb threat seemed the main motive, but likely wasn't the immediate issue. There was already a war, as we all know, last June, the so-called 12-day war, because it lasted exactly 12 days. And in that particular conflict, the Iranians had already launched ballistic missiles at Israel, and Israel responded with aerial attacks. And to be brief, the Iranians apparently possessed approximately 2,500 ballistic missiles targeting Israel prior to the June war. And after that war, they had far fewer because some were destroyed and some were fired and their numbers were down. You must understand, everything I'm about to state, everything I will say, should always be scrutinized because various accounts exist and the precise facts and figures remain unknown. But they had far fewer missiles after the June war. What we did see, however, was that the Iranians were able to replenish their stock relatively quickly. And now, at the beginning of this year, 2026, in January, February, we apparently reached a point where the Iranians again had that many missiles, namely around 2,500. Just like before the June war. And it became clear that the Iranians are able to recover quickly from these strikes and rearm. But not only that, according to Israeli intelligence, the Iranians weren't merely considering a program, they had already initiated it. Their long-term goal was to produce 200 to 300 such missiles each month, with the specific aim of accumulating up to 8,000 ballistic missiles within a short span of 1 to 2 years. And that, of course, from an Israeli perspective, would be an unbearable acute threat and a more immediate threat than a possible atomic bomb, which we'll also talk about later. Such a ballistic missile, it has 1111, a warhead carrying approximately 300, 400, even 500 kilograms of explosives. If such a ballistic missile, let's say it scores a direct hit on a multi-story building in Tel Aviv, then that building is completely gone and everyone inside is dead, even if they're in a shelter. Even if it's not a direct hit, it still causes damage. 100, 200 meters away from the building, people can also be killed by the shock wave, by the flying fray fragments. But a single missile, such a missile, has the potential, so to speak, to utterly destroy that house or all its inhabitants. Now let's make a conservative estimate and say that 100 people live in such a 7 or 8-story building. If there's a direct hit and they possess 8,000 missiles, and as previously mentioned, they had a comprehensive plan to more than triple their arsenal from 2,500 to 8,000 within a brief period. And that was a realistic goal. 8,000 missiles multiplied by 100 fatalities, if each one was a direct hit, would result in 800,000 deaths. So that is a potential that is apocalyptic. Of course, it's true that by no means do all of these missiles manage to achieve a direct hit. Thank God. And Israel, of course, as we know, has probably the best missile defense system in the world, with its various layers. You most often hear about the so-called Iron Dome in English, or Kipput Basel in Hebrew, the Iron Dome. That's not really relevant in this context because this system is designed to defend against short-range rockets, just like the ones Hamas launched from the Gaza Strip. They're also harder to intercept because short-range missiles are airborne for only a brief 2 or 3 minutes, making it much more difficult to react and intercept them. We're talking about a different system that is specifically used against ballistic missiles. In Hebrew, it's Hetz, Arrow, 3rd generation, Arrow 3. So it's the 3rd generation, Arrow 3. The main point is that these ballistic missiles are projectiles that fly at hypersonic speeds, meaning 5 to 6 times the speed of sound, and they maintain a high, a high trajectory, and they send other ballistic missiles at them, well, not just ballistic missiles, but also hypersonic missiles to intercept them in the air at a high altitude, ideally even up to about 100 kilometers high, and in the best case, still outside of Israeli territory. So Israel possesses this defense system, and it is also highly efficient. As I said, first, not all the missiles that get through are direct hits, thank God. And second, the Israeli defense system boasts an approximate 90% success rate, which is fantastic. But even with 90% intercepted, it still implies that 10% penetrate, and those can inflict significant damage. Therefore, the calculation made by the Iranians was naturally that since they possess a multitude of rockets numbering in the thousands, they could launch several hundred missiles daily, continuously, for an extended duration. That could go on for weeks, and that would naturally overwhelm the Israeli missile defense system, because as you saw in the last June war, you can really hurt Israel with ballistic missiles. And Israel aimed to preempt that, which likely served as the primary motivation for Israel, in collaboration with the US, to engage in this conflict by late February and into March, intending to neutralize the immediate threat posed by the production of these missiles. And what's especially important here is that, of course, Iranian missiles were destroyed, including ballistic ones, some that were ready to launch on their ramps, and others that were in storage somewhere. And this time again, after the war, the Iranians apparently had, from an original 2,500, as we said in February, to now, as we're speaking, so to speak, the estimates vary. There are various intelligence reports in America that suggest not as many missiles were destroyed. However, it's safe to assume that the Iranians, in turn, only possess around 1,000 or perhaps even slightly fewer missiles. However, an even more significant aspect of this conflict was Israel's deliberate action to prevent the ongoing manufacturing of these missiles from continuing this time. This means a large part of the Israeli airstrikes targeted the missiles, of course, but also focused on the Iranian arms industry and the entire production chain for these missiles, including steelworks and petrochemical plants that supply materials, the entire logistical supply chain, and the means to transport them. So, from an Israeli standpoint, one of the primary objectives, in my view, though opinions differ, was, firstly, to neutralize as many existing missiles as possible, and secondly, to preclude Iran from replenishing its depleted missile stockpiles. And Iran did lose missiles, of course, mainly because some were destroyed, but it also fired some, naturally, that's clear. Indeed, it launched hundreds of rockets at Israel, and it also fired hundreds of rockets at the Arab Gulf states, which is quite concerning. It fired more missiles at Arab states than at Israel, by the way. Again, the situation is Iran has many fewer missiles than in February. because it used some and because some were destroyed. But even more critically, it's highly likely that this Iranian missile development program has been set back considerably, or in the best possible outcome, has even been extensively dismantled. And from an Israeli perspective, that's a good outcome, of course, but from the Iranian perspective, not so much. That was the first point. And the second important point is, of course, the nuclear program. The Iranians plan to develop and possess an atomic bomb. And that particular topic was probably discussed quite extensively throughout the duration of the war. Wouldn't you agree? Perhaps even more about the ballistic missiles, at least outside Israel. And one can imagine, and this is especially a topic again now, because there are efforts between the USA and Iran to somehow solidify this arms freeze with an agreement. And there are demands from the United States concerning the halt or oversight of this Iranian nuclear program, and the Iranians do not wish to comply with these requests. And that, of course, always carries a significant question mark because, as you will recall, after the June war, American President Trump had already declared that the Iranian nuclear weapons program was obliterated, completely demolished, no longer in existence, utterly wiped out. So why are we now negotiating over a nuclear program that has already been wiped out? And isn't he contradicting himself there? Firstly, one must say that this isn't necessarily a contradiction because something could well no longer exist, specifically the various installations Iran requires to develop an atomic bomb. But, and this is probably the case, the Iranians' intention to renew it, to start it again, may still exist. And if there is such an agreement, which probably won't happen, but maybe it will, one wants to guard against the Iranians starting it all over again from scratch. And secondly, when Trump made that statement, he was definitely exaggerating, but there was still a kernel of truth within it. It can be said with a certain degree of confidence that even after the most recent June war, the nuclear weapons program of the Iranians was largely crippled. Various nuclear facilities were obviously attacked, particularly the enrichment facilities, specifically their centrifuges. And it is pretty certain that, for example, since last June, and that's almost a year ago, Iran has not enriched any more uranium, perhaps because it didn't want to under the current circumstances, but also perhaps because it couldn't. This implies that the nuclear program, as it had been established up until the war in June, no longer exists in that particular configuration. And it would likely, and we'll talk about this more, take years for the time factor to bring it back to its previous state. And that in this current war, which began on the 28th of February, the Iranian nuclear program, from an Israeli or broader viewpoint, wasn't necessarily at the forefront of concerns. This is also evident from the fact that in the ongoing conflict, the majority of Israeli airstrikes haven't focused on nuclear sites, but rather on various other targets, such as missile facilities and other strategic installations. For example, we know, though, precise information is lacking that this war quite certainly began on the 28th of February with extensive ongoing aerial bombardments, primarily from the Israelis and also from American airplanes. And throughout the initial days, there were absolutely no nuclear facilities targeted whatsoever. It wasn't until the fourth day of the war, March 3rd, that an Israeli airstrike hit a nuclear facility for the very first time. This was at Natanz, where enrichment centrifuges currently are, or rather were, buried. The entrance to Natanz was attacked yet again in a further attempt to achieve something more significant. But the impression was that in this war, the most recent one, nuclear facilities were no longer targeted, partly because there wasn't all that much left to destroy in that specific area. This further indicates that Iran's nuclear program has been significantly damaged. And now there's this, perhaps the most critical nuclear asset of the Iranians, which we frequently hear about, those renowned 440 kilograms, a clear sign that this program is indeed in a weakened state. Of uranium enriched to a relatively high 60%. However, that is still not enough for producing an atomic bomb. For that, it would need to be enriched to 90%. But this is now playing a significant role again. It's something we're hearing much about in these ongoing negotiations, or attempted proposals between the US and Iran, with the US demanding control, perhaps even requiring its removal from the country. And there was quite a lot of discussion about that once again, even during the recent conflicts. So where is all this material? And now again, specifically during these ongoing negotiations. And The fundamental reality is that this specific quantity of enriched uranium, if processed to a 90% enrichment level, would hypothetically be adequate for the creation of approximately 10 to 11 atomic bombs. That does sound quite alarming, but the crucial emphasis there is indeed on theoretically, meaning in practice it looks very different. First, you have to consider, as far as we know, these containers holding uranium enriched to 60%, likely in a solid crystalline state, which, if heated, can revert to a gaseous form and be further enriched, are now buried deep beneath mountains of rubble and debris, making them virtually inaccessible and likely beyond reach. So, theoretically, it's located within Iran, but it's unlikely the Iranians themselves can get their hands on it. We also do not know if it is located in a single spot or dispersed across multiple sites, such as Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. And apparently the Iranians haven't even attempted to retrieve it from the ground, regardless of its buried location. And what's certain is that the Israelis and the Americans are watching this very closely. Because first, if there's any activity and the Iranians really do try to get it out, then you'd finally know where it is. One could track it either by attempting to immediately halt these so-called excavation efforts or by subsequently monitoring where it's transported to and how it is ultimately utilized. But as I said, they don't even have their hands on it yet. But even if they could get their hands on it, it would still be a very long way from becoming a nuclear weapon. From this material and with this material combined, many, many more steps would still be needed to truly make an atomic bomb. First, you would have to enrich it further from 60 to 90%. And then there would be various technological steps. You'd have to convert it, a conversion into a metallic form. One would have to design a chain reaction. Then naturally, you would also need to devise a reliable detonation mechanism. You would have to mount that onto a missile, and then you would need to harden and prepare it so thoroughly that it could actually withstand a missile launch. Because thankfully, not many atomic bombs have been deployed throughout history, and the only instances we know of were when the Americans dropped bombs from planes in Japan. That's an entirely different kind of technology and a completely distinct challenge compared to simply launching it with a missile, you understand. So, there are many steps that would still be necessary, and as things stand now, Iran probably can't carry out a single one of these steps. So first, they don't have the material, and even if they did get it out, it would still be a relatively long road. And now you would have to try to measure how long that would take. Before last June's war, people always discussed breakout time, though its precise meaning is often quite confusing. The term breakout time actually refers to the duration from the current moment until a country possesses a sufficient quantity of weapon-grade, specifically enriched uranium to construct a single atomic bomb. This is often confused with the time needed from now until I have a completed bomb. And as I've already described, that's a much longer period of time. But anyway, whatever was meant before the last war in June, they were talking about a few weeks. And now the whole thing is being measured. Whatever one understands a breakout time to truly mean, it's now measured in months, if not even years. This means, in other words, the Iranian nuclear program has been quite significantly set back one way or another, regardless. And the prospect that Iran might possess an atomic bomb in 1 year, or perhaps 2 or even 3 years from now, is by no means pleasant, but it's far more palatable than the possibility that they could have possessed an atomic bomb within a matter of weeks. And therefore, in that regard, the Iranian nuclear program has been significantly set back. However, it's sometimes mentioned that Iran might construct a so-called dirty bomb. But that's something else entirely. From an Israeli perspective, and in general, that is not an existential threat. A dirty bomb is considered a more primitive weapon. This isn't based on a nuclear chain reaction and atomic explosion, but rather a conventional explosion that scatters radioactive material, which naturally is also extremely undesirable and quite concerning. However, for Israel alone, and we are discussing Israel here, such a device would certainly not present as significant a threat as a classic atomic bomb. And perhaps for us here in Europe, it would at most pose a certain threat to European cities, because if terrorists were to obtain such a dirty bomb from Iran, made from those 440 kilograms of material, kilograms as the basic material, that would certainly not be very pleasant. From an Israeli perspective, one must also acknowledge there's no inherent danger from such a dirty bomb, primarily because it's nearly inconceivable that it could ever be successfully smuggled into Israel. So, once again, we don't know if, when, or even how Iran might perhaps once again set about trying to acquire an atomic bomb. However, we can state with considerable confidence that, let's say, in the short to even medium term, there is currently no nuclear threat emanating from Iran. And that, once again, was more of a defeat for Iran and certainly more of a victory for those who sought to prevent it from happening, namely Israel and the United States of America. But beyond that, we're still discussing the military aspect. There's also the element of the conventional army in and of itself to consider. And there too, in this conflict, without a doubt, the various components of the Iranian army, whether they were fully established or not, were very, very severely damaged. From the very beginning, there was no such thing as an Iranian air force. Iran possessed no fighter jets. There have been virtually no reports of aerial combat operations between Iranian aircraft on the one hand and American or Israeli aircraft on the other hand. Iran did possess a relevant air defense system, specifically S-300 air defense missiles, which it had acquired from the Russians and primarily deployed to safeguard its nuclear program, crucial military installations, and its essential infrastructure. This Iranian air defense, which was indeed taken seriously by many, was gradually and steadily dismantled over time. That had actually already begun, if you recall. The first confrontations were already in 1924. For the first time, there was a missile attack from Iran on Israel in April of 2024, and then again in October. And Israel retaliated each time, and even back then, Iran's air defense was significantly damaged. Then, once more, in the June war of last year, and now, it's presumed that the remaining elements of the Iranian air defense system have been completely neutralized. We haven't witnessed any situation where Israeli or American planes were essentially put in distress or significantly jeopardized due to these events. And furthermore, yes, drone bases were unequivocally bombed. There was, or rather there is, or perhaps was, I'm uncertain if it still exists, or ever truly did, an Iranian navy. Frigates were sunk, Iranian submarines were decimated, and naturally military installations in Iran sustained extensive damage. This included facilities belonging to the conventional regular Iranian army, as well as those of the arguably more perilous force, the so-called Revolutionary Guards, encompassing their gathering points and communication centers, and training centers, whatever else. Countless targets in Greater Iran were attacked, and in that regard, Iran lost quite a lot concerning its conventional army. Indeed, a significant amount was taken from them. And this was also, I'll briefly mention it in a couple of sentences, but it is perhaps the greatest accomplishment when we reflect on the past few years. Let's talk about Iran and its geopolitical situation. For many years, Iran invested an immense amount to build what was referred to in Israel as the ring of fire surrounding it. That is, this chokehold comprising the various allies that Iran had consistently used to fight its battles. We're talking about Hamas in the Gaza Strip, about Hezbollah in Lebanon. Assad in Syria was a strong ally of Iran. He was instrumental in establishing this vital connection, facilitating significant arms deliveries towards Lebanon and ultimately Hezbollah. And Iran itself, naturally, though it was also anticipated that they would all come to each other's aid. So for the first example, when Hamas did on October 7th, Yahya Sinwar, certainly expected back then that everyone would come to their aid and offer assistance, including Iran itself, for instance, and that they would be fully supported by everyone. That didn't work, of course. The Palestinians from Gaza, HAMAS, were largely left alone. And conversely now, with the war having broken out between Iran, Israel, and the USA, Iran probably hoped its allies, what was left of them, would come to its aid. Hezbollah did do that to a certain extent, but this tactic ultimately did not work, and the situation is now completely different. Hamas in the Gaza Strip is still there, but significantly weakened. Hezbollah in Lebanon is present, but significantly weakened. The Assad regime in Syria has totally disappeared, and as I've already pointed out, Iran is also likely very, very severely militarily weakened. Thus, this entire scenario, painstakingly constructed over decades, somehow failed to materialize from Iran's point of view. And on top of that, one must also mention the catastrophic economic situation in Iran. They're experiencing over 50% inflation. They're printing banknotes worth millions. There's also widespread poverty, sanctions, rising unemployment, and the loss of all those billions in investments they'd already made. Medical care in Iran, from what one hears, is in very bad shape. There's a critical shortage of medicine and a severe lack of resources. And yes, last summer, for example, there were times when water rationing was enforced throughout all of Iran. This is also due to a drought caused by climate change, but also because of Iran's poor infrastructure, resulting in water being lost within the pipelines. There were also intermittent power outages, making for a truly desolate situation. This dire state was precisely what compelled the populace to demonstrate and rise up at the year's outset, a movement that was subsequently and quite brutally suppressed. But that, in essence, was the actual trigger, or the initial link in the chain that ultimately led to this war. And this catastrophic economic situation certainly hasn't improved. On the contrary, these ongoing wars have most certainly exacerbated it in Iran. Therefore, when one considers the entirety of this situation, it becomes undeniably clear that no, this is certainly not the appearance of winners, is it? Wherever you look in Iran, much functions, but many things don't, and much is damaged and shattered. However, it obviously hinges on the definition and on the so-called narrative. You and I, living here in the West, probably have a very different understanding of what victory means compared to fanatical Islamists. They look around, which also applies to Hamas in Gaza. They see widespread death, even among their own leadership. They see destroyed houses, suffering people, and a massive economic catastrophe. But they see themselves as victors and confidently declare, "We have won." Their victory to them solely consists of having somehow stood firm against the formidable powers of the USA and Israel. And from their perspective, they've already won. For Hamas, you could put it this way: if even a single terrorist survives, if just one is still there, they can declare themselves the victors. Then a Hamas operative will emerge from a tunnel shaft or a destroyed building, flash the victory sign, and they will proceed to hold victory celebrations. When they look around, everything is utterly destroyed. The hygienic conditions are absolutely terrible, and there are destroyed houses all over the place. But from their viewpoint, that's entirely sufficient for them. They truly couldn't care less about the civilian population, nor do they give a damn about how people are actually doing, be it in the Gaza Strip or in Iran. Now, naturally, an objection can be raised, one that's heard quite strongly in Israel, often as a critique of the leadership, posing the question, did we truly handle this correctly, and have we genuinely accomplished our war aims? Because even in Israel, people are saying, hold on, the regime in Iran hasn't been toppled and Hamas still exists in the Gaza Strip. Theoretically, they are still capable of launching rockets, they are still present, and thus Israel's war objective has not yet been accomplished. It's a failure for Israel. Perhaps the war was completely pointless and a total defeat, but I believe that in itself is a misunderstanding, especially considering how it was perceived outside of Israel. Because at no point was the overthrow of the Iranian regime officially declared by Israel as one of its primary war objectives at any phase of the conflict. I haven't heard any statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Katz, Army Chief Amir, or anyone else that explicitly stated, we are now entering this war with the objective of overthrowing the Iranian regime. We are now entering this war with the objective of overthrowing the Iranian regime. That wasn't the stated war. We are now entering this war with the objective of overthrowing the Iranian regime. No reasonable person can expect airstrikes alone to achieve regime change, especially in a country like Iran, or that a regime change will be brought about at all. This has practically never happened in history. There is only one approximate example of it. That was the 1999 NATO bombing campaign against what was left of Yugoslavia, which ultimately led to Kosovo achieving its independence, and Milosevic subsequently lost his grip on power, or something along those lines. That was accomplished, so to speak, only from the air, but it's not really a comparison, and it was never possible from the start with just airstrikes. No, the declared objective of the war from an Israeli perspective was, as previously stated, to significantly diminish Iran's military capabilities to the greatest extent possible. And again, overthrowing the regime was never named as a war objective, so you can't just say, well, you lost the war because you didn't topple the regime. That's absurd logic. Therefore, this significant weakening of Iran's capabilities, I believe, has largely been accomplished. I have attempted to clarify that point. It's additionally crucial psychologically. This taboo around Iran has been fundamentally broken. because for decades, Israel has been observing Iran and sensing a brewing threat. It's a radical regime that is building a nuclear bomb. However, it was always said that one could not truly dare to confront Iran head-on. It's too powerful, too large a country. In terms of area, it's 80 times the size of Israel. It is extremely dominant, so one cannot truly dare to do that, as they would retaliate horribly, and that would result in absolutely terrible consequences for Israel. And until now, they hadn't dared to do it. But now it has indeed happened, and as I've already explained, it had terrible consequences for Iran in reverse. And closely tied to that is probably the deterrent effect Israel has managed to achieve here, which is also incredibly significant from an Israeli point of view. I think, regardless of whether one likes Israel or not, Israel has undeniably demonstrated itself to be the preeminent and most formidable military power in this entire region. And what was particularly remarkable, truly unbelievable, was the exceptional performance of the Israeli Air Force. Such an event has likely never before been witnessed in military history. For weeks, Israel dispatched an unprecedented number of aircraft, clearly demonstrating its capability to do so across such a vast distance. We're talking about 1,500 kilometers. You have to fly there and then fly all the way back. Those are many hours in the air. Technically incredibly difficult, involving mid-air refueling and coordination with rescue teams, should anyone be shot down or need to eject from the aircraft, ensuring they can be extracted. And there was also an incredibly tight and exceptionally close coordination with the American Air Force. It's said that such an event has never occurred in history, and it will be taught in military academies that the coordination of who attacked where in this vast Iranian territory was so meticulously precise, right down to the micro level. This means that even individual pilots, both Israeli and American, were communicating with each other, exchanging not only crucial information but also valuable experiences. Thus, that was truly an astounding achievement, and once more these operations involved thousands of aerial sorties and offensive maneuvers. Thousands of targets were engaged across hundreds of waves over vast distances, and I'm not sure if it's been brought to your attention, but Israel, remarkably, did not lose a single aircraft or a single pilot during this entire operation. That alone, technically and mechanically, is a tremendous achievement. The air-to-air defense from the Iranians, as we've already observed, was simply not relevant to the situation at all. But to repeatedly fly such long distances, countless flights, and virtually nothing went wrong, that, I must say, is an absolutely incredible achievement, and whether one finds joy in that accomplishment or not is a personal choice. And at the same time, it must be said, and this is the other side of the coin, in a military sense, Iran was completely defenseless. Iran had nothing to counter it with militarily. It was completely exposed to the Israeli airstrikes. So it was not a direct army versus army conflict then. Iran had absolutely nothing to stand against them, and that's precisely why it turned out to be entirely asymmetrical. Because how else could Iran defend itself? With something entirely different, as we know, specifically through terror. It could only deploy an indirect terror weapon. Well, one aspect was, naturally, the sheer missile bombardment, the constant shelling, the launching of numerous ballistic missiles, particularly targeting Israeli cities. That's not actually a military weapon. While these missiles may target military objectives, they are in essence pure terror weapons. They serve no real military purpose, but instead are launched into densely populated areas with the sole aim of destroying as many homes and killing as many innocent people as they possibly can. This makes them a weapon of terror, not one of military strategy or defense. And in this regard, it's absolutely evident, and this is something that's brought up far too infrequently, and I am certainly no legal expert, but it is unequivocally clear, every single one of those Iranian missiles constitutes a textbook example of a war crime, because that is precisely what a war crime is, firing on civilians with no military purpose. And each one of these missiles is a crime, that much is clear. That's one terror weapon against people, and the other terror weapon, of course, is the well-known economic terror. The Iranians have the good fortune, so to speak, the geographical luck of being situated near the Strait of Hormuz. And they've exploited that, effectively blocking an international waterway, a vital international trade route, and are essentially holding the entire world for ransom. And also what's interesting is if we specifically focus on Israel, this actually has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. And this blockade of the Strait of Hormuz could be completely irrelevant to Israel if it were entirely selfish, as it doesn't harm them. Israel gets its oil from a completely different direction, Azerbaijan, via pipeline, through Turkey, and so forth. So Israel has enough oil, and the Americans themselves have enough oil too. They also suffer from the fact that oil prices have risen, and gas at the pump has become more expensive, which in turn harms the economy. But the ones really suffering, the ones being blackmailed, are the Europeans and the Asians like China, which isn't getting enough oil. So Iran, having no other options, unhesitantly and unscrupulously deploys this weapon of terror as a matter of course. So a completely asymmetrical war with military means on one side and terror tactics being deployed on the other. So on the other hand, are there going to be huge victory celebrations in Israel? No, of course not. There is absolutely no euphoria at all. There are, we could say, definitely mixed feelings. There was even, in fact, a certain level of surprise when Trump, quite suddenly, I believe it was on the 8th of April, announced a truce and stated, "We're pausing our interventions in Iran to try and establish an agreement, a ceasefire, and somehow solidify it." And in Israel there was surprise, despite the fact that they shouldn't have been surprised at all, because from the very beginning they had fully anticipated that this would take 2, maybe 3 weeks, and then Trump would just call it off saying enough. But it actually ended up lasting a whole 6 weeks. Yet when he finally did declare it was enough, people were initially quite taken aback and didn't really know how to position themselves on it. On the one hand, among the Israeli people, there was, of course, an incredible sense of relief. They were so tired, they had had enough, the economy had suffered. People had been drafted. Some businesses couldn't function at all because only those with adequate air raid shelters for all their employees could remain operational. The schools were closed, the children were at home, and of course, as was already mentioned, the flights were grounded too. The airlines stopped coming. Tourism had been gone for a long time, and above all, people were utterly weary of these rocket alarms. Every single night, once, twice, even 3 times, having to get out of bed, and with the children going out of bed and so on. On the one hand, they were fed up, they desired a return to normalcy, yet on the other hand, there was a sense of regret, feeling it was a missed opportunity, as the army perhaps needed just another 1, 2, or even 3 more weeks to inflict further damage on Iran's military capabilities, its strategic plans, and its infrastructure, thereby gaining precious time and pushing Iran back even further. And in Israel, one sometimes had the feeling, and many expressed it, that they would have endured this situation with the constant rocket alarms for another 1, 2, or even 3 weeks, paying that price to gain even more peace and quiet or to further weaken Iran's military capabilities. Someone put it succinctly, the former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. He articulated it this way: every additional day of war provides us, here in Israel, with another full year of tranquility and peace. Of course, that's just a slight bit of an exaggeration, so to speak, and naturally it's not like 40 days of war will now bring 40 days of peace and quiet, not at all. We have no idea what it would achieve, but that was pretty much the prevailing attitude or sentiment felt in Israel. So, to summarize everything, yes, of course, the regime in Iran is unfortunately still very much present. We're not getting rid of it. Others have surrendered. Even the Nazis eventually surrendered, and the Japanese eventually surrendered. But these individuals, these mullahs, this regime in Iran, are not ideologically wired to ever capitulate or surrender. The catastrophe of their own people, the suffering of their own people, as we've seen, is not only completely irrelevant to them, but they are also capable of massacring thousands and tens of thousands of their own population in the streets. They probably still hold on to the ideological intent of getting a nuclear bomb. They are probably even more motivated because they have seen that indeed, only an atomic bomb would have had sufficient deterrent effect, sufficient deterrent power to truly protect them in the future from the Israelis and the Americans. And just imagine now, truly, if the Iranians had, for instance, already possessed an atomic bomb during this particular conflict. They likely couldn't have been harmed at all, and we've witnessed the sheer brutality with which they operate. And that, of course, would represent a truly terrible danger. There have always been throughout history 2 distinct schools of thought, and one of them. In view of Iran, or from the perspective of experts from Iran, one school of thought suggests it's certainly not ideal for the Iranians to have an atomic bomb, but even if they did acquire one, they surely wouldn't be mad enough to actually use it. They are quite pragmatic, you know. They would realize that it would only bring about their own destruction. So it wouldn't be all that bad after all. But the other school of thought says, no, that's not the case at all. These are completely fanatical, highly radicalized ideologues. Firstly, they are fighting for, and this is the explicit goal of the Islamic Republic, the expansion of Islam, and even more so for the expansion of the Shiite interpretation of Islam. And they believe in the return of the Mahdi, who will only return after chaos and destruction come first, and then a war is won. And according to this particular school of thought, they would, without a doubt, very readily deploy an Iranian atomic bomb. And that naturally then becomes a profound and pervasive danger for the entire world. Probably even for Europe as well. Certainly if they also developed the corresponding missiles for it. But for Israel it would be a particular danger because Israel is being concretely threatened with annihilation and Israel would be in the front line. So the interim assessment is of course that the regime is still there and we don't know where this is headed. And the famous Iranian clock, that clock just keeps on ticking forward. You probably know there's the clock, the one in Palestine Square in Tehran. It's quite famous, isn't it? That goes all the way back to the Ayatollah Khamenei, the father, the one who is no longer among us or is currently residing in the depths of hell. I don't know where he is at the moment. He prophesied in 2015 that Israel would be annihilated by the year 2040. And because of that, in a large square in Tehran, a digital clock was erected, one that serves as a countdown to the annihilation of Israel, meticulously counting down the time until its destruction, down to the very last second. And apparently that clock is still ticking, so they are still anticipating the destruction of Israel. And conversely, Israel will continue to issue warnings and will try to protect its interests if such an agreement is reached. For the time being, much of this is justifiably linked to Netanyahu's name, as he has been the most vocal and consistent in warning about the Iranian bomb over recent years and decades. This is also because he was prime minister, albeit with interruptions, during the time when this became a more pressing danger. But truly every Israeli prime minister since the early 1990s, ever since Rabin, has consistently warned about the Iranian nuclear program, stating something must be done, and attempted to rouse the world, which has proven to be a very slow undertaking. I don't know how the world sees it now. People are conflict averse and we don't know where this will lead. That is indeed the current situation. As I mentioned at the outset, we truly don't know where it's headed and the entire matter is not truly calculable. I feel a bit reminded, and I'm coming to my conclusion now, of the Lebanon war back in 2006, so almost exactly 2 decades ago. It didn't quite have the same scope as with Iran, but at that time Israel was also combating Hezbollah in Lebanon, which had been launching attacks on Israel. Back then, even ground troops were involved. So a war was fought, and after that war, there were some very sour faces in Israel because they felt they hadn't truly won. Hezbollah was still very much present. Their planning had been poor. They weren't adequately equipped. And perhaps the war shouldn't have been waged at all. And Hezbollah celebrated its victory simply because it had somehow survived. But what happened next? For 17 years after that, Hezbollah did not fire a single shot at Israel, not even once. They only started again in 2023, after October 7th, specifically on the 8th. On October 8th, the day after, they fired on Israel again for the first time to come to Hamas's aid, albeit to a limited extent. Even though that war wasn't considered very successful from Israel's perspective, it did purchase them 17 years of peace and quiet from Lebanon. We don't know how many years of peace have now been gained by setting back the ballistic missile program and hopefully by setting back the nuclear program as well. This delay is valuable. However, each year of peace is undoubtedly a blessing, and each year of peace also represents a potential window of opportunity during which the Iranian population might rise up against this regime and perhaps even bring about its downfall. And once this regime has finally fallen, we might then be able to reflect upon just how much these wars of 2025, even into 2026, will have ultimately contributed to its eventual downfall. Thank you all.